Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm Stuart Grant. I'm the current chair of FBE Manchester, and I'm looking forward to chairing this debate this morning on the future of town centres. We originally planned this event we invited the panel back in January. Can you remember as far back as January for an event that we planned to hold in April? And we all know why that was cancelled, but we really still wanted to have the dialogue, albeit in the virtual way that's now become normal. And even more so because just over a year ago, the same panel took part in a breakfast event I hosted for the Greater Manchester Chamber. So you can understand probably why we wanted to see how the recent lockdown experience has influenced the panel's views and thoughts on how town centres need to change in response to the massive challenges we now face. Big challenges, but big opportunities as well. So whilst we may not be able to offer you the usual big FBE breakfast and hospitality today, we can offer you up-to-date insight and thought leadership on what's next for our GM towns. And we're keen to hear your views. So post your questions or observations as we go along, and we'll aim to pick up on as many of these as we can later in the session. And please get involved and let us know your name and your company details. That would be really helpful to know who we're talking to. Thank you very much to Hydrock for sponsoring and producing the event today, and for their loyal support to FBE Manchester over recent years. Hydrock is a multidisciplinary engineer with offices in Manchester, Hale and across the UK, and finds itself at the heart of some of the leading regeneration projects in the country. Just to set some context, there's an increasing focus on the emerging economic and social impact of COVID-19 beyond the immediate and tragic health aspect of the pandemic. Most of the raw stats are jaw-dropping. The economy shrinking 20.4% in April, the largest monthly fall on record. Online retail sales up from 18.9% in April to 32.8% in June. Only 14% of retailers paid their rent due on the June quarter day last week. The Trafford Centre into many retailers and businesses in receivership. Hard reading, harsh trends, tough challenges ahead. A significant piece of work that's emerged in the last month or so is the COVID-19 supplement to the Grimsey Report, a report first authored back in 2013 on the future of the vanishing high street. It's a pragmatic and balanced document, and it clearly captures the key challenges facing town centres now across the UK. The Grimsey Report offers 27 practical measures to help reimagine our town centres and high streets. It suggests the radical reform of archaic planning restrictions, rent and rate structures, and it promotes people-friendly transport solutions, increased greening, placemaking, and bespoke ideas. At its heart is the demand to give local authority and community leaders the power to take control and reshape their town centres in a way that works for their own specific needs. The key need being to reverse the identikit clone town centres that grew like a rash beyond the 1980s. Well, I have to say, I feel better for getting that last bit off my chest. So thanks to our panel for wanting to get involved in the discussion today, and a big warm FBE welcome to Rebecca Heron, Director of Economy and Skills at Wigan Council, John Searle, Director of Economy at Rochdale Council and Chief Executive of Rochdale Development Agency, to Jerry Brough, Director of Place at Bolton Council, and Matt College, Director of Into Places and a board member of the High Streets Task Force. So let's get into it. We've got a lot of ground to cover, But if we can start with your own personal reflections, if there's just one thing that you've taken from the last 3 or 4 months of lockdown and how it's influenced your thoughts about what needs to change or how even the future might look like, what would it be? I'm going to start, if I may, with you, John.
Thanks, Stuart. Morning, everybody. I mean, I think it goes without saying that, so it's going to be two things, apologies, that, you know, for health, obviously just have shot up everybody's personal agenda, haven't they? But I would say that my biggest reflection has been about this phrase, new normal. And actually for me, it's a bit the opposite, that everybody's situation is different. We've got to think about every scenario, whether that's your work life, your family life, your health, all these kind of things are contributing to the fact that there is no normal, actually. And that, for me, is the biggest point of all this. We need to look at every scenario, every situation differently.
Thank you, John. Becca?
Hi, I think for me, on reflection, I think the crisis has accelerated a number of trends that we were seeing already. So you've already talked about declining high streets on the basis of retail. Obviously, this is certainly not going to help any retailers out there at the moment. I think it's also accelerated trends in relation to flexible workspace, the valuation of green space, for example, the importance of leisure facilities. So for me, obviously, we are in a sort of very difficult period at the moment, but I think that actually it's accelerated and has made more urgent some of the really difficult things that we were already dealing with.
Thank you. Thank you. Jerry, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Yeah, I guess my single biggest thought around this is that people now, everybody now accepts the need for change. We've talked about regenerating town centres for some time and changing them, but I really didn't feel that there were a lot of businesses out there who believed in that. I think they thought they could still go along with the same business models and everything would change around them. But I think now everybody, retailers, people in the nighttime economy, people in leisure theatres, everything is recognised that they need to change somehow. And it's a question really as to what do they change to and how quickly does that change take place and what will it all cost? So for me, that's the big thing that everybody's now thinking about change and how to do it.
Thank you, Jerry. And last but not least, Matt.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, everybody. I completely agree with what other panelists have said. I suppose one of the other observations I take away from this, our smaller district centres have actually held up better than some of our bigger town centres. And interestingly, if you look at our regional centres across the country, most of them are really struggling and will continue for some time to do that. Interestingly, though, Manchester, the city centre, is actually doing slightly better than London, and there's a reason for that, because obviously a lot of people live in the centre of Manchester, and that has provided a degree of buoyancy, albeit still very difficult. So I think it'll be interesting to see whether this continued drive to try and repurpose towns as a place to live as well will continue and will end up being somewhat of a lifeline for our towns. Thank you, Matt.
I just want to move the theme on to sort of localism. You mentioned that, localism and leadership, because I think the situation that we're in, strong intervention and entrepreneurial spirit is absolutely needed from local leaders who can almost fast track community engagement and make difficult decisions on solutions that are best suited to local interests. John and Jerry, what needs to happen and quickly to make that intervention happen? There are examples throughout the UK about where strong intervention and leadership has made things happen quickly. What's your thoughts, please, John?
I think that the biggest thing that we face from a kind of political local leadership aspect is the short-termism, really, of politics, and being able to set, and that's say a role for me as a senior officer working in a local authority environment to advise my members that we need to be looking 10, 20 years ahead and producing our, one of the things we've been looking at is a growth plan, growth strategy, looking that time ahead. And because that's setting the vision, isn't it? And that's what we've got to try and look to. And then we've got to use that to influence our conversations with governments and with the business community as well. So, in other words, that's the plan of action. That's what we're all working towards. And yeah, okay, things do kind of have short-term blips in them, but that's going to be our long-term aspiration. I'll turn my mic off as my dog stops barking now.
Jerry, any thoughts on that?
That's a cue for me to come in then, John. I mean, we were reasonably fortunate, I guess, in Bolton that we had a well-developed plan, and it was a cross-party supported plan. All the politicians supported the plan. So really, there was a strong leadership to actually get that plan in place. The council put £100 million on the table to help implement that plan. That's a huge commitment of leadership. So really, in the last 3 months, I guess the challenge around leadership has been to get them to hold their nerve, to get them to actually stick to the plans that they originally. They'll need to be modified, no doubt, to some extent. But by and large, the trends that we see now, and this comes through in the Grimsley report, they were happening before COVID. COVID has just given them a big push. So it's getting politicians to just hold their nerve, understand that we don't have all the answers at this point in time, that things will evolve, it's a changing and evolving situation, and that we will be able to deliver maybe on a slightly longer time frame than previously thought, and maybe with some slight tweaks along the way, but it is still achievable if we've got that collaboration with the development partners that we have worked so hard to develop over the last couple of years. So that for me is something that leadership needs to just show that commitment to the plans that they've already set, basically.
Thank you, Jerry. Matt, you obviously, as you know, you sit on the High Street Task Force board. What priorities are they driving at the moment?
Well, it sort of links almost to the last point in a sense. Just not, if I may, just on leadership is I think there's an additional dimension in that leadership can also come from within the town itself. They're hugely complex things, towns, but they're also very rich within sorts of organisations, businesses, people and communities that are within them. And you can draw on some of that to really help take your town forward, particularly if you want to create innovation and growth. And so the High Street Task Force was set up to try and help bring, particularly obviously working closely with local authorities, but anybody who's got a stake in wanting to try and make their place better, but there's a capacity issue. So drawing across all the different disciplines that makes up the High Street Task Force, from built environment stuff and planning and data and greening and place leadership, it's providing a real support, information, data, and advice and guidance to those towns that are seeking to do that. And of course, the COVID crisis has meant we've had to redouble our efforts there and really try and make sure we're reaching and touching as many people as possible. So there's been a lot of focus on a recovery plan to help towns to see a route out, but it's going to be a long haul, and in that sense, I'm rather pleased this is a 4-year journey and not what sometimes happens just a 12-month. Thing. I think the point we're hearing before from the previous speakers is things take time. It has to be a long-term view. So that's really our focus in the immediate point, but looking to the future. Long-term
view, but definitely intervention is required. I think Rebecca, you sat on the or you were part of the original team that negotiated with government on Manchester's devolved powers. Are there any lessons learned then that we can use now?
Well, I mean, I think devolution is as important as ever, and I still think there's a really long way to go on that journey. I think we've only got sort of a small proportion of what we need. Government talks still about levelling up. That is more important than ever, and a stimulus package is required, but it's more than just the money, I think. It's about the way the resources are allocated and managed and accessed, and I think we need much more control over those resources and the ability to allocate those resources flexibly. A really good example, and I'm sure that Jerry will share my pain, is that we waited for nearly a year for our HIF funding announcement. and we weren't successful, but that's 11 months of waiting for really critical funding. We've all submitted bids for future high street funding, and I know sort of colleagues are part of the Towns Fund process. Bids have gone in, we're waiting till autumn, an unspecified date in the autumn to hear about that. Well, speedy access to those resources is going to be really, really critical to intervening in town centres, because as I've just said, you know, some of the trends that were causing us real issues before have just accelerated. But yeah, I think there are loads of further flexibilities we need. As I say, it's not just about money. Skills and employment obviously is going to be a critical issue coming out of this. GM has lobbied for a long time for greater flexibility over the way that the skills services are managed, so we can better join up careers advice and guidance with training opportunities. We need much more influence over the way the apprenticeship levy is administered, for example, job match services. So devolution is really, really important, and if government is serious about levelling up, we need to revisit a lot of those arguments.
Thanks, Becca. Interesting you mentioned skills, careers, apprenticeships there, because I just wanted to touch briefly on the one of the recommendations of Grimsby is to get our children and youth more involved with the design and planning process. I think a system that happens in Norway and probably elsewhere. That seems a no-brainer to me, but how do we make that happen? Matt, I think you have some thoughts on that, maybe?
I apologise. My sound dropped out, so I didn't hear the question. You might want to go to someone else first.
I'll just read it again, Matt. I just wanted to pick up on the one of the recommendations of the Grimsby report being that we get our children and youth more involved in the planning and the design process, as in terms of overall consultation. I think that happens in Scandinavian countries. It just seems a no-brainer in today's world. How do we make it happen?
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? We're talking about a long-term approach. So we're building for the future. So you're absolutely right. We should be consulting with those people who are going to be using our towns in the future to inform what they're going to look like. I think on reflection, probably don't need to reinvent the wheel too much. I mean, it wasn't about planning, but the technique will be the same. A few years back now, GM actually did do I think it might have been a conurbation-wide approach of engaging young people about what they might be able to do, what they want to see happen in their towns. They were tasked with coming up with some ideas. They came together in a great big forum, worked up their ideas, presented them back. That informed thinking about towns. And then I believe, from what I recall, they were then tasked to go back off and make it happen in their town. So I think certainly in Altrincham, we created a proper engagement forum where young people were very much involved in what they would like from the town and what they can contribute to it. And I think it's just trying to plug that in, even if it's not in a formal process through the planning system. I think helping it to inform strategic thinking is really, really important.
Thank you, Matt. Okay, I'm going to just move it on now to really one of the key issues, which is how we do reimagine the high street, how we reimagine the town centre. I think, without doubt, recent lockdown experiences has helped everyone realise that we can't continue to judge town centres or high streets by the success or failure of retail alone. So I'm just interested to know how the recent experience has made you all rethink your own town centre schemes or your planning priorities. Can somebody kick me off on there? Maybe John. How has recent experience affected your future development plans?
Well, in some ways, as was said earlier, I'm not sure we're kind of ripping up the rule book, really. I mean, I heard a phrase, I think it was probably the end of April, that 5 weeks of lockdown accelerated online retailing by 5 years, and that's it's probably going to turn out to be true, isn't it? But I'm not sure that certainly we weren't looking at the future of our town centre being purely about retailing, and we've been working over 10 years on a wider plan for that, and that probably applies to a lot of the GM towns. And so I think you've got to be careful that you don't knee-jerk react and say, okay, right, surely it's the death of the office because everybody's going to work from home. Well, no, I don't think that is the case. It's obviously had a major short-term impact, but in the medium and long term, how might it change? Well, we might have a bit more working from home, but we might also have a bit of, on the opposite side of the coin, a bit more space in the office that people want to spread out a bit more. So the actual overall demand for office might turn out to be the same. Where it might change is it might be a bit less city centre centric and might be a bit more town or locality centric. And so there might be a role there for managed office space as a co-working space within the GM towns rather than directly in the city centre, for example. So that's probably one. That's probably one example. Just another quick one, Stuart, was we've been looking at residential schemes and apartment schemes, and so we've been thinking about, well, should we actually flex the number of 1 beds into more 2 beds, which gives you an office space if you want it, or a second bedroom, a bit more space, a balcony for fresh air, things like air handling. How do we manage that? So, but again, being very careful about what is a short-term impact and what is a potential long-term impact. Thanks, Stuart.
Thank you, John. Jerry, because it's all about flexibility. It's about trying to future-proof. What are your thoughts and how is it affecting your plans?
Well, I agree with everything that John said, and most of the towns are on a strategy of bringing people back into their towns, of reducing the shopping space and so on. All the things John said, I'll not repeat them all. I think one of the interesting things will be to see how we respond in terms of supporting infrastructure, because it's always been it's not always, the last 15, 20 years, it's been a problem for councils to get their mind around things like creating parks in the centre of towns, because parks require upkeep. And up until now, developers and residents and business users didn't really want to contribute to these kind of spaces. Well, they might have to think about contributing to them in the future if they want these kind of spaces built into their schemes or into the centre of the town. I think the other thing I would say is that at the minute we've got barriers all around the town centre to expand the size of footpaths onto the road, keep people safe so that there's more room for people to walk. It'll be interesting to see whether at the end of this these barriers get taken away, or whether we actually widen the footpaths and narrow the roads. And so it's clearly that's going to have a cost associated with it, but it's about intent, isn't it, really? And that's when you'll start to really, I think, start to find out whether a lot of these things are going to stick, or whether it's easier just to go back to the way it was. So I think the infrastructure around pavements, roads, cycle paths, parks and gardens, general open spaces that people can, these types of things attract people into the town centre. It'll be interesting to see where with funding will come for that, for the ongoing maintenance and upkeep of all these things and so on. And I think that's something that I haven't seen too much discussions about, and not even the Grimsby report.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Jerry. And Becca, Wigan were one of the first sort of local authorities to actually invest in town city centres distressed assets. You purchased the galleries back in 2018. What stage are you at now with that?
Well, I mean, I would just echo the points that John and Jerry have made. Initially at the beginning of lockdown, I was sat there, I guess, feeling like I've spent 2 years putting plans in place and they've all just crumbled at my feet. Actually, that isn't the case. We've revisited, we've reassessed our long-term plan, and it remains, as I've already said, in a lot of ways, it's now much more urgent to diversify the town centres. So, there was a lot of conversation internally with colleagues, but the council's commitment to redeveloping the galleries, and not just that, but to bringing forward our other plans for the civic centre, for the King Street area, they remain. Inevitably, we did have to pause the procurement process for a development partner, just because the council as a whole was very focused on responding to the crisis, redeploying staff, providing those frontline services. But the procurement process kicks off again next week with a detailed dialogue stage, and the council's commitment remains. And actually, I'm really lucky that I have the support of colleagues in that respect. But there's an absolute recognition that if we don't partner on this, if we don't lead the work to to redevelop and diversify the town centre, it's just not going to happen, and these trends are going to accelerate, and Wigan will become a ghost town.
Yeah, okay, thank you for that. One aspect that comes into my mind is the fact that, you know, town centres used to historically, Industrial Revolution, be about, you know, places where manufacturing took place. But then with all those dirty industries and public health aspects, everything had to move out into the suburbs. And be replaced, I suppose, the town centres with commerce and retail and all those things. But new manufacturing now is different, isn't it? And I just wondered what opportunities you see to attract the makers, you know, the clean energy, the digital, the tech businesses back into the towns and cities. Anybody, any thoughts on that?
Stuart, I mean, Manchester area, generally speaking, has obviously got a rich manufacturing heritage, and a lot of advanced manufacturing, niche manufacturing is still undertaken in Greater Manchester. And I know Rochdale's statistic is 14% are employed in manufacturing. So I don't think it's gone away. And I think there definitely is an opportunity to further this, because I think, you know, things like onshoring and other kind of a green industrial revolution, you know, these are the kind of phrases that have been mooted, haven't they? So I think there's a real opportunity there, and you know, Manchester, through the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework, you know, we've got the opportunity to grow in terms of employment space as well, and create new opportunities there. And you know, as an example, I guess, you know, we built some small industrial units up at Kingsway, and we had half of them let just before pre-COVID, and we had 3 or 4 in legals during the start of COVID, and of course they all just stalled. But we've since let an additional 4, and we've only got a couple left, and they're now in legals as well. So we're probably going to let up the remaining 50% of those units during COVID. So there is still a strong industry out there, even during the COVID period. And there's definitely an opportunity, as you say, in digital and green manufacturing, I think. Okay.
I'm just mindful of time. Crikey, you turn your head and we're half an hour in. One of the other things that's definitely come into my mind in the last week, covered by the media and Boris, is just the confirmation, the realization that as a nation we have the highest obesity rate in Europe. But much of our leisure and hospitality industry is absolutely dominated by bars, by coffee shops, by restaurants. Do we need a major overhaul, a major review of the leisure sector in line with the increased working from home that appears to be a factor now, and the government's obesity strategy, so that we sort of reshift the emphasis more onto sport, more onto fitness, more onto health and well-being, which has obviously been a key topic in the last year or so? Who'd like to pick up on that?
I'll pick on that, Stuart. I mean, I don't think if you looked at the various cities around or towns around Europe, they'd have a markedly less leisure industry or number of pubs. It's not to do, I don't think, the number of establishments. It's probably to do with the fact that people here don't seem to be able to do it in moderation, generally speaking. So for me, that comes down to kind of education and making people understand what's important in life. And to be honest, if the COVID-19 hasn't taught anything, anybody anything, the one lesson that must get out of this is that your health is probably central to anything that you want to do, and it's central to society, and it's central to business, and it's central to the economy. So, there has never been a better chance to focus people's attention on staying healthy. You see that with all the stuff that's going on in the TV at the minute, or with the gym and exercise classes and so on. So I think there has got to be a huge kind of public education program put in place, a public information program that draws people's attention to the fact that you can enjoy yourself in the pub and eat out at restaurants, but you can also still participate in sport and leisure facilities, and it's about getting the balance, isn't it, between the two?
I think, Stuart, if I may, that there's something about how you can try and build health into the actual physical environment. and that obviously makes us think about transport and connectivity and accessibility, and creating an environment that you want to go, not just obviously want to go and visit, but when you're in it, you're able to walk across it. You're not driving right up to your office door. As you mentioned, the well-being aspect, so it's a place that actually sort of nourishes you rather than diminishes you. There's a whole way, I think, just the physical environment and how towns work can have a health focus built in, and clearly the public health at the moment from COVID is very much at the forefront. But I think there'll be longer thinking about how we make our towns just more healthy to use.
Thank you, Matt. 5 minutes left before we move on to audience questions. So just picking up on some of the comments that have been made about green sort of pedestrian cycle friendly town centres. Obviously the connectivity is absolutely key, and I just wondered how you saw that before these interim cycleways and pedestrian improvements are made. And the town is no longer designed around the car. Does this recent behavioural change affect, for instance, the need for HS2, for HS3? What are your thoughts on that? I'm going to come to Becca.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have seen some really interesting shifts in terms of an increase in walking and cycling. I have to say that I think, you know, as we move back to more traditional sort of ways of working, and I know sort of we are hoping to embed some of the changes, I think it'll be interesting to see how permanent some of those are, but I think we need to be working to try and make them more permanent. So John and others have talked about some of the interim measures that we've put in place to make walking and cycling easier and safer. We are looking at that, but to be honest, Greater Manchester was looking at that already through the B network and the significant funding that the Mayor has put in to support walking and cycling to the boroughs. And we've been quite careful in Wigan to make sure that that investment is planned in relation to destinations, so our town centres. I think HS2 and Northern Powerhouse Rail will remain important. That is much more about, you know, levelling up the north, making it easier to commute, to work, to joining up. It shouldn't be as hard as it is to get to Sheffield and Leeds from Manchester and Wigan. But I do think it's about promoting healthier, more efficient, greener, cleaner ways of moving around the region. So, like we've been trying to do, we're trying to look at it holistically, but it is going to take significant investment from government. People will only make those transport shifts when it's affordable and it's practicable in terms of time.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to move on to the last question in this structured bit, which is really about, and it shouldn't be left to last, but it's all about sustainability and the environment, which of course is higher on the agenda now than it ever was with the behavioural change through working from home and other things. So in that respect, it's really good. But I just wondered how it was affecting your own sort of net zero plans, your sort of environmental strategies for the future. Anybody kick me off on that? Maybe John, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think COVID's going to accelerate this agenda as well. I think, you know, we're seeing especially the young people's reaction to the use of plastics and how that's really pushed people's agenda over the last 12 or 18 months, hasn't it? And, you know, people almost start to wake up and see the issues that are being presented here. And I think things like, you know, I think all of the local, all the councils in GM have now announced a climate emergency, and they're all working at GM level towards various policies in the next 10 to 15 years. And so, you know, getting the public estate in order in terms of its zero carbon credentials, any new build housing, you know, and how that should be, you know, how we can try and develop new housing as net zero carbon as well. You know, that's easier said than done when already lots of areas, including Rochdale, struggle with, you know, financial viability on certain types of housing stock as well. And so, you know, we're seeing in the environment, you know, localized flooding issues and all these kind of issues are starting to contribute towards, you know, the future. You know, we need to do something about this. We need to do it now. And bringing us back to what we're talking about, kind of youth panels and youth groups as well. You know, I think that's where they can have real added value in really pushing, because, you know, let's face it, a lot of our kind of senior officers, politicians, you know, are of a certain age, and you know, that's the really where the youth can get involved and drive a change agenda, I think.
Thanks for that, John. That actually ties in as we segue almost seamlessly into the audience questions from, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to pronounce this correctly, but Mayren at Bura Happold, thank you for your question. What's your view of balancing green and climate emergency with the economic recovery? Could you indicate your early thinkings of green recovery initiatives? Does anybody else want to say anything specifically about that?
Stuart, I'll just say something. I think it might make it more difficult, actually, to initiate a green agenda. The next few years are going to be very, very tough in terms of capital available. I know the government is spending money, but I think private businesses are going to find it difficult to allocate capital to introducing new technologies, unless there's a real financial benefit to them in the short to medium term. I think it's something they might put off. So I do think actually COVID might slow down some of the technological innovation around green technologies, and in generally within the physical landscape of towns, because of the reticent or the inability of companies to really, you know, allocate sufficient capital resources to these new technologies. So that would be my fear. I can see that happening, and unless some legislation comes through to encourage companies to do it, I think it will be quite challenging to get them to move into new technology areas at this point in time.
I think it's a really interesting time, isn't it? Because I think in the last few years I've seen a ramping up of investor appetite for sustainability, and they've almost been influencing and driving those requirements back down to the private development sector. So I just wonder if we've got to the stage where there's so much momentum fueled by the public that we're it's almost going to drive that. But anyway, moving back to questions, and here we are. This is a very polite question from a good old friend, Stephen Gleave of ACON. Good morning, Stephen. It says, good morning. What positives do you take from the PM speech yesterday? What was missing that you would have wanted to hear? Becca.
I mean, well, I suppose I kind of touched on this a little bit when I was talking about the importance of devolution, funding, stimulus packages, but flexibility around that. I mean, you know, 5 billion isn't quite, I think, the scale that will deliver a real New Deal, as Boris set out. Obviously, investment in infrastructure, housing is all very welcome, but it just felt to me that there's a real lack of substance in terms of a sort of considered, strategic, joined up approach to driving recovery. And I know that we're in early days at the moment, but I think it does link back to that point about, you know, local leadership, greater local powers to drive a recovery solution for individual places. So yeah, we'll see where the 5 billion gets us, but it's not going to be the shot in the arm that we need, is it?
Thank you, Becca. Anybody else? Any comments on that, Jerry?
Sorry, I'll go before Matt. I mean, I think there's a huge issue around how you get from the statement of funding to the actual delivery of funding, and I didn't see anything in that thing that said we're actually going to do things differently, and that means, as Becca's referred to earlier, the notion that the local authorities and people like ourselves have got time to enter into endless number of competitions, you know, to get funding. When we don't know what the rules are, when they change the rules halfway through, and when you get a decision, you don't know what the decision is based on. It's just, we don't have the time to waste, to be honest. So there has to be a streamlining of delivery. A classic example of that was the well trumpeted announcement by Mr. Jenrick about money that was available to accelerate capital schemes. When the guidance came out, you realise that you have to have the scheme built, completed, and the person in the building by January 2022, otherwise it doesn't qualify. And you're thinking, well, how many schemes do you know that you can start from scratch and deliver in the space of 18 or 19 months? It makes, you know, the announcement saying, I'll wait to see the detail. I guess that's what I'm saying, and how they're going to deliver that.
Thank you, Jerry. Matt, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, that they were really important macro points, but mine is, I suppose, a small micro point, but could have big implications for towns. And that was the news that in terms of change of use of commercial properties over to residential in particular, it doesn't require any planning permission. Now, as a former Conservative council leader, I'm all up for streamlining and removing bureaucracy, but you know, there's an inherent risk in that. And I'll use a very local example to myself. I could see a developer, if this was Altrincham 10 years ago, say, "Oh, I'll buy the Market House. I'll turn it into nice apartments." You could have the hollowing out of particular zones of our towns that we need to curate to become certain parts of the town that suddenly just become residential. So there's a risk that there needs to be the ability to fast track, almost like Jerry was talking about in terms of getting funding. But it needs to be done in a considered and strategic manner. And so I think that's, to me, at the moment, from what I've observed, something I'd like to understand a little bit more about, because there are some inherent concerns there.
Thank you, Matt. So going to move on to another question from Jed Cowser. Morning, Jed, architect principal at BDP, and only the other day on the TV for a hospital that he's been involved in over the last 7 to 10 years. Our towns have fantastic potential to become great places in which to live. What we see is that public-private developer partnerships are becoming a great way to achieve that. Is that an increasing trend that the panel can see as a way forward? Who wants to pick up on that? Becca? Becca?
Yeah, we're all coming in on this one. But yeah, I think that towns are a great place to live, and it certainly is going to take public and private sectors working together. There's, you know, residential is a key component of our plans for Wigan Town Centre. It was before the crisis, but actually, again, and I think one of my colleagues, I can't remember who it was, made reference to actually the potential for towns to really establish themselves as a result of this. They're accessible, sustainable locations, and, you know, but in the absence of a proven market, we know that the public sector has to act as a partner in establishing that market. But I think we've already talked about the fact that retail can't be the primary offer anymore. It's just not sustainable. Again, it comes back to the point that actually what you need is a mix. So for residential to be desirable, you need that wider offer. You need attractive public spaces, you need good transport links, you need a leisure offer, a food and drink offer, and retail will be part of that. But I think residential has to be a key element of the plans for most town centres going forward.
Thank you, Becca. Anybody else like to just have possibly a closing statement? Because John, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Stu. I mean, just to add to what Becca just said there, I mean, it's absolutely essential in my mind that public-private partnerships exist here to make the change and to make the pace of change that we're talking about. You know, Rebecca just talked about, you know, the lack of proven markets in some towns, and that's therefore a role for the public sector, isn't it, to work with the private sector to put in some additional funds or de-risk it, or however, to get those kind of projects to the starting line. And because, you know, demand is one issue, but then quality is another issue, and some of these projects, you know, are challenging from a viability point of view, and therefore getting the right level of quality is another big challenge, and creating the kind of sustainability of it, in the sense of, you know, the future of this town centre needs to be for the next 50 to 100 years, not just the next 12 to 18 months. And councils, of course, have a role to play in setting that, you know, long-term vision and working with the private sector to deliver it. And what we've been trying to do is set all the foundations for private sector investment, and then at some point, you know, want to hand over the baton to the private sector so that let them go away and deliver it. That's our approach.
Thanks, John. I think that's a good place to finish. That's a good, strong, positive message. And time's upon us. It's 1:45. Just a brief thank you and close. Really, could have gone on for ages. Really, it's cruel. 45 minutes isn't long enough. So sorry if we've not been able to cover some of your questions today, but we have been recording this, so we'll make it available to people in the next day or so and share that with you. That just leaves me to say thank you again to our panelists, to Becca, to Jerry, to John and to Matt, for all your contributions today. A lot of joined up thinking, it seems to me. Thanks to Hydrock for sponsoring and helping us put the event on in the first place, particularly Harry Williams and Graham Munday. Thank you to Sophie Brocklehurst at FBE Central, to Emma Williams on the FBE committee, especially for helping to organise things. It's at this point that we normally have a big hug in a room, but we're just going to have to accept it's a virtual hug, and probably that's a real benefit for some of you. FBE Manchester are planning a couple more of these in the webinar series in the next few months, so details will be out shortly on those. And finally, just thank you to all of you for taking part, for getting involved, for listening. And I hope you can take something away from the discussions today. We're definitely living in tough times, and that requires new ways of thinking from all of us, but we normally like to rise to a challenge. So in the brave new world that we live in, let's just grasp it. Thanks again, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. The sun is absolutely out banging here. So I hope you have a good day and hope to see you soon. Goodbye.